So, first of all, a little bio. Bruce MacKinnon is a native of Antigonish, Nova Scotia. He studied at St. FX, Mount Allison, and the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. His first professional experience in cartooning was at the age of 14, when he was hired to draw cartoons for the local weekly, The Casket. What a promising name.
What a promising name,
yeah.
Indeed.
In 2015, I'm sorry, I missed the card. Yeah, he joined the Halifax Chronicle-Herald full-time in August of 1986. He's published 4 books of cartoons and caricatures. In 2013, the Chronicle-Herald published Drawing Opinions, mainly featuring his cartoons. He lives in Halifax with his wife, Peggy. His daughter, Robin, is a visual artist, and his son, Jameson, is a drummer who performs with Bruce as the father-son duo, Bruce and Jay. In 2015, Bruce and Jay won Best of Halifax Readers' Choice Award for Best Cover Band as chosen by readers of the coast. Bruce has won 5 national newspaper awards for editorial cartooning. He also received the NNA Inaugural Journalist of the Year Award for 2014, as well as 18 Atlantic Journalism Awards for editorial cartooning. He was awarded honorary doctorates by St. Mary's and NASCAD University. He was appointed to the Order of Nova Scotia, and he received the Friend of St. FX Award. In 2014, he won the World Press Freedom Award and took second prize in the 2014 Niels Booga International Cartoon Award. On February 17, 2017, he was invested in the Order of Canada, and at the time, a special mention was made of his poignant drawing of the National War Memorial following the death in October 2014 of Corporal Nathan Cirillo. In May 2017, he won the Townsend Award of the Association of Canadian Cartoonists. Mr. MacKinnon has agreed to be my guest in this series designed to highlight the life and work of exemplary Canadian personalities who have entrusted their personal archives to Librarian Archives Canada. The Bruce MacKinnon Fond bears the very romantic name of Fond R1055. Consists of 91 drawings dating from 86 to 95 that were published in the Halifax Herald, and it focuses on local, national, and international events and personalities. Even though the drawings are from more than 20 years ago, some of the themes and issues still resonate today. Mary Johnston Miller, who's with us today, is the archivist responsible for the MacKinnon Fond. So Mary. So first of all, Bruce, thank you for accepting my invitation and agreeing to celebrate the opening of Librarian Archives Canada Eastern offices here at Pier 21. The format we chose for this conversation is quite simple. We're going to show a number of cartoons from our phone, and I'll ask Bruce to comment on their context of creation, the editorial choices he made, etc., so we can have a look behind the scenes at his art. We're going to start with local themes, then national, and finally international. So, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Our first cartoon is from April '89. The caption reads, "So then they said, first off, let's make it harder to get." That cartoon followed an announcement by then Minister Barbara McDougall of a series of reforms to unemployment insurance, including longer qualification periods and shorter benefit periods. So how did the mountain and the mountain goats become the theme of the cartoon? Why is it more efficient than humans, the proverbial humans who show up at the wise men retreat on top of the mountain? Why the goats?
Well, in thinking about how to do a cartoon, how to present something in the newspaper, your opinion in the newspaper, you're usually dealing with visual metaphors, and when the federal government is trying to make your unemployment insurance harder to get, you're trying to think in your mind, how far away can I put it? What's the furthest point? On the highest mountain on Earth, it was a starting point. I think, subsequent governments, the Harper government, were looking at other planets, and that might have been the next cartoon. But we used to call it, these things are, between 25 and 30 years old. These are very, very much older cartoons. So I had to be refreshed on a lot of the news issues behind them, because memory isn't what it used to be. But we now call it, of course, employment insurance, not unemployment insurance. But yeah, that was, it was just a matter of finding, a way to put it, a way to show the government was making it as hard as possible to get for the average person. The little bit of comic relief.
Second drawing was published in '93, and it depicts a boat named East Coast Fishery. It's sinking as the captain continues to man the ship's wheel. So this refers to a standoff between local fishers and a Russian carrier ship, and more widely to the issue of overfishing by foreign countries.
Yeah. This, again, goes back to, it looks like 92 or 93. Some of these cartoons will even be...
Yeah, 93, I believe.
Yeah, and I started in 86. So my style, this is very early in my career, my style was developing all along. And for the first 5-10 years of my career, there were nothing but fisheries cartoons. It was the collapse of the cod fishery on the East Coast. It was a huge event, and it was in the newspaper every day. I did fish metaphors till I was sick to death of them. And I mean, there are a lot of them that you can access, but after 10 years of fisheries cartoons, I couldn't get away from that subject fast enough. Yeah, in this case, it was the proverbial, another fine mess you've gotten us into, with the government always. I think one of the key problems that kept coming up was when you mix, I guess, scientific data showing cod stocks or fish stocks and as guidelines, and you mix politics with that. And local MPs that have to keep getting reelected, and their fishermen don't like that their stocks or their quotas are being cut, and that kind of thing. Then that's when you have problems. And so this was coming up a lot. It was governments that were saying, well, no, on the one hand we have to cut back, on the other hand, no, we want to get reelected. So these kinds of cartoons came up a lot of conflicts where politics were causing problems.
The next cartoon is also about overfishing. But
Imagine that.
One of my favorites, by the way, is Foreign Overfishing. It's a 1994 cartoon based on, of course, the classic poster from the film Jaws. But it's not a shark, it's a beaver. And it goes after a boat labeled Foreign Overfishing. So that was after then Fisheries Minister Brian Tobin promised to take action on overfishing. So how did the Jaws imagery come to you?
Well, it's just how silly can you make it? I mean, first of all, when an MP, a cabinet minister, talks about taking action, government action is almost an oxymoron. So I expected, your typical, terse memo or something like that to stop the Russians from overfishing. The same problem with the Portuguese, and nothing was happening. We were being fished out. And I mean, we're not exactly a big and scary country. Our national animal is a small furry rodent with yellow teeth. It's not very intimidating. So it's just the idea that I was predicting. There's not a lot going to happen here. The Russians aren't going to say, "Oh, sorry about that. We'll be on our way," because we've got a beaver, and we're not afraid to use it. So anyway, the idea of combining that with Jaws, which was obviously, it strikes terror in the heart of every moviegoer, I thought was a pretty good contrast. Yeah,
I guess I haven't looked it up. But I guess that was probably the summer Jaws was playing, or no, it was an earlier.
It was
movie.
earlier, yeah.
It was earlier than that.
But Jaws is a movie that will never die.
No, but the poster, the poster was still on people's minds.
For sure, yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, it's one of those metaphors that it comes up in in cartoons from time to time. You know, it's just one of those unforgettable images, that poster. Of course, they always tell you, sharks don't do that. They don't swim straight up. My son tells me that anyways.
The fourth cartoon depicts Governor General Ray Natashin, and he's reading the speech from the throne in 1994. And although it's the speech from the throne in Ottawa, it relates to a very local topic. So it was felt, so it says, speech from the throne, throne from the speech. Yeah. And it was felt at the time that the speech failed to address the problems facing the Atlantic provinces, and that's what prompted this cartoon, I guess.
Yeah. Speeches from the throne are traditionally pretty big snore fests, and they're not an annual thing, but they're a fairly regular thing, and so we tend to make fun of them if they make enough news to make it worthwhile. But in this case, there was a pretty obvious admission to Atlantic Canadian issues in the speech. And when you're trying to think of an idea, or a cartoon, the ideal cartoon is it's just an image. If you can avoid using words at all, then to me that's the ideal cartoon. But sometimes you resort to punchlines, and you have word balloons and gags, whatever you need to use, whether it's sarcasm or just however you formulate a joke. Sometimes it's word plays, and that's very simple. Speech from the throne, throne from the speech. In the run of a workday, with a deadline at the end of the day, you use whatever you get.
Was that play on words from you, or was it something that was floating around? It was from you.
No, it was from me. I normally don't so much. I like to be left to my own devices. The history of editorial cartooning is it didn't really start out that way. Normally, back in the day, it depends on how far back you want to go, but editorial cartoonists were somebody who could draw, that they could haul up to the editorial meeting, and the powers that be at the newspaper would say, we want you to draw this, we want to tear down whatever the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party, depending on the political leaning of the paper, and do something on this issue and do this. Even Bob Chambers, who was my predecessor at the Herald, would tell you that when he first started out, that's what his job amounted to. He was a hired gun, and he was told, he could draw, and he was told often what to draw. If he could think of a better idea himself, then he was able to do that. But as the years went by, and people like Bob Chambers and Duncan McPherson, and so many more after, Terry Mosher, Roy Peterson, newspaper editors began to understand if you left a cartoonist to his own devices, you'd probably get a better result. And of course, that you might have to sacrifice your own ideology for that. And today's newspapers like to at least pretend that they're objective, and rather than being a liberal paper or a conservative paper, whatever it happens to be. So no, I like to be left to my own devices. But if my wife comes up with a better idea, I'll take it. There you go. Editors too. I've worked with some really great people over the years, and every now and again a good idea comes up, and I'll take one from an editor. But yeah.
Next cartoon is our last local drawing, but it has universal scope. It shows a musician having a coughing fit, and in the fourth panel, a banner that says Du Maurier presents the Atlantic Jazz Festival. Yeah, because there was this law in early 2000s, I guess, against ban on cigarette advertising, but sponsoring events was like a way to go around that. Yeah. And so this is what you chose to show people, and that was before, of course, the ban on those types of events.
Sponsorship, the advertising. Yeah, and it was extremely important to the Atlantic Jazz Festival. It really, I don't think the sponsorship has ever been the same since they had to basically, cut off the Du Maurier sponsorship. It was a dependency like being addicted to smoking, to tell you the truth. Mm-hmm. And the Jazz Fest was very important to me. I have a lot of friends in the musical community. One of their brothers is here. And I have a friend, John Chesson, his brother Andre's up here. John played as a bass player, played with a lot of great bands from the Maritimes. And he's a real tremendous jazz player. And so I used to go down to see him play. Jazz Festival would run, for a week through usually my working week. And I'd try to sneak down and do my cartoons at the festival. Mm-hmm. If there was a band, or if John was playing, or there was a band I wanted to see, then, just sort of nip out around noontime and take my drawing board with me and the pens and find some place to sort of hole up and where I could see the stage and draw the cartoon while I was there. Every now and again, slip over to the beer bar, and sometimes the drawings would come back a little more crooked than others. But no, I have very pleasant memories of those days, and when the Jazz Fest was just around the corner from the Herald. But this is strictly a comment on our dependency on cigarette advertising.
Yeah, it's more busy than other drawings I've seen from you. It has 4 different boxes, and there's a lot going on at the bottom. Wheeze, cough, act, cough, act. It's unusual for you to use more than one frame, isn't it?
Yeah, the beer must have been working that day. I really don't remember why. You need in that case, you needed to build it up, And like I say, whatever concept you have on any given day, you just... you do what you have to do to make it work. But,
Let's turn to national teams. First cartoon from May 1990 is full of the Midge Lake Accord symbols.
Oh, yeah.
Brian Mulroney has his hands full of the kids, 4 of the premiers of the time. And he sings the Kenny Rogers number, "You picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille," except it's... You picked a fine time to leave me, Lucien, referring, of course, to the resignation of Lucien Bouchard. So, what a stroke of genius! How did that come to you, Lucille, Lucien? You had that in your mind. You had that punch already, or?
Well, I grew up in Antigonish, and any small town usually has a lot of country music playing on the radio, and they played that song to death. There's a lot of Kenny Rogers on CJFX. So that song, this is, 10, 15 years later from my years in Antigonish, and I still couldn't get that song out of my head. So it was there, Lucien was leaving, so you picked a fine time to leave me, Lucien. I don't know how these things come up. I used Kenny Rogers a couple of times in cartoons, though. I did when Don Cameron was premier. And there was some issue with video gambling machines that were very unpopular, and he was coming up to an election, and I did him as in a cowboy hat and everything, and he's got his video gambling cards because he's at the poker table, and it's you picked how's it go? You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. And election time was on the calendar. So yeah, Kenny Rogers has been good to me. Yeah.
Staying on the Midge Lake team, next cartoon was published 2 days later than the previous one, and it shows the ghost of René Lévesque flicking ash from a cigarette to start a fire on the Accord. Yeah. So you drew this one after Lucien Bouchard sent his famous telegram to the Parti québécois discussing Lévesque's legacy.
Yeah.
Was that, I've asked other cartoonists in the past this question, was that period of constitutional debates the golden age for cartooning in Canada?
It was fantastic. It was fantastic. I wasn't living, obviously, in Quebec. Mosher Aislinn in Montreal had, you know, a bird's eye view of some of the, you know, these were watershed moments, and so every cartoonist, it was kind of a golden age for cartooning too, because it was still pre-internet. It's some of these cartoons I look back on and I grimace, the, you know, because my style, again, was pretty early years for me. But yeah, these were golden times, I guess, for editorial cartoonists, in the same way that the Trump years are now. You know, there's material every day, and there's something, you know, in the case of the constitutional issues. I mean, we were sick to death of it in some ways, but something important was happening, and you knew it was a critical time. So, but I, you know, really looking at this cartoon right now, I really just wanted to go to town on René Lévesque. I just wanted to do a nice big character. He had such a great face. Yeah, and the cigarettes and so on. I would have, well, Terry Mosier, I think, was famous for putting them in every orifice in his body, and you know, I would have done that too, except that's Terry's, he staked his claim on that.
So a drawing like this, how much time did you actually spend on it? Because you said no internet, so I know now that cartoonists will use some software, etc. But that was hand drawn.
Yeah, well,
Totally.
and most of my stuff is pretty much all of it. Yeah, I mean, my cartoons, my originals are all on. They're on a thick paper right now, and I start out with pencil, just for the sketch to lay it all out. Then there's India ink, and I still use one of these old quill pens that you dip in the ink well, and just like the dinosaurs did thousands of years ago. And once the ink is dry, I put watercolor over it. So it's almost entirely the same way I did back then. The only difference back then, they were all black and white. Yeah. So all the tones that you would you know, have to describe in an illustration, gray, you know, shades of gray, were all done with cross-hatching, which is an old technique most cartoonists use. I mean, there are different things you can fall back on. But the interesting thing is that you notice it's not all black. There's an odd little color in behind René Lévesque there. We use this stuff, a lot of cartoonists use it back then. It was called duo shade. And basically, it was kind of paper that actually came with the lines invisible. And you got these little bottles of chemical. And so one chemical would basically, when you spread it on as if you were painting, it made the lines suddenly appear. So they were like, you know, in the same way, if you look closely at a newspaper, you see a dot screen, right? Yeah. Well, this was like a line screen. So if I wanted to do a big gray area, I would paint this chemical on, and lines would come one way. If I painted the second chemical on, it was two ways, so it was darker. It was just twice as dense, and it was darker. Almost all cartoonists used it back then. The only downside of it was light sensitive, so it would actually change color, and so it looks a little out of place in some of these cartoons. But yeah.
So how many hours to draw this one?
I'm not even sure. The way my day works is that the later I think of the idea, the quicker I have to draw it. So, because the deadline's always supper time, you know, 5 o'clock, you've got to hand it in. So,
because this one looks like it's got a lot of details in the face and.
Yeah. So you know, it could have been 4 hours if I thought of it earlier. It might have been 6 hours. You never know. It's hard to say. Wow. Sometimes you do a caricature and it comes to you right away. It looks like the person, and especially if you've had a few years to get used to the person. But sometimes you struggle if it's a new face and find just the right features to exaggerate.
Next cartoon, it needs a bit of explaining. It shows Senator Alan MacKinnon, and he's wearing an attire similar to the Mohawks protesters in Oka. Okay, yeah. And he's saying, we're not going to let Brian Mulroney desecrate our sacred burial ground.
Yes.
And it's a comment on Prime Minister Mulroney's naming of 9 senators, including Premier Buchanan of Nova Scotia, in order to override the Liberal senators' opposition to the GST. Yeah. So you're actually mixing metaphors there. You're using something that was very much in the news at that time, I guess the Oka situation.
Okay, exactly.
And then the Senate.
Yeah, that's a device I got in the habit of falling into a lot, where I would take two different issues and just combine them. So just the idea of dressing up MacKinnon as one of the Mohawk protesters seemed like a fun idea at the time. But and of course, you know, the Senate being the sacred burial ground of all, you know, all the career bureaucrats and politicians, it just struck me as appropriate. But yeah, and he's a local, obviously a local, was a local cabinet minister, a very, very important guy in Trudeau's government. So that resonated pretty well in the province of Nova Scotia. But yeah, I do tend to fall back on that device, combining two issues. Oka was huge at the time, and
do you think it's something you could draw today with our perception of the First Nations and all the reconciliation talk? Would you do that today?
I would do it. I'm not sure if the reaction would be the same.
Okay.
You never know until it's out there, and you wait for the tomatoes to fly. But yeah, no, I don't think I would see anything. Yeah, you never know. Live dangerously.
Another take on the Senate from 1991. One of the senator comments on the fact that the proposed attendance bonus for senators has been rejected by the Speaker of the House of Commons. He says, "I wonder if this decision will also affect our staying awake bonus and our paying attention bonus." So you use the Senate a lot in your cartoons, don't you?
Still do. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's like Donald Trump. It's an endless source of material, and I mean, it's, you know, every government after government wants to reform it and change it. It's in the paper right now. I mean, they're holding up legislation. Trudeau and the independent senators he created are suddenly, you know, becoming a bit of a nightmare for him. So yeah, it is. And well, of course, the last couple of years with Mike Duffy and all that adventurous stuff, that was, you know, I should be sending these guys my paychecks. Yeah, they've been a source of material for a long time. I'm looking at this, and again, this is one of those cartoons that makes me grimace, because it's my old, very you know, early style, and you can see some of the Dua shade in the background again too.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the Senate has been good to me.
Are you familiar with the Daumier little creatures at all? Because that senator looks very much like one.
Is that right?
You've seen all the politicians at the time, and Daumier did the little statues of them.
I'm familiar with Daumier's work. Yeah,
this one really looks like one.
Oh,
so
take that as a compliment.
I think you should. So, speaking of staying awake bonus, the next cartoon is actually based on the national. That's my favorite, by the way. National Hockey League strike of 1992. Yeah. And it's titled Canadian Foreplay. And it shows a couple in bed, and the man says, "Say, hon, you know, seeing as the league's on strike and all." And the best part of his drawing is the terror in the lady's one open eye.
Okay. I have to do a little demonstration here. If you're drawing an eye, and you only have the one eye to draw, if this is the eye, you see the line, the eyebrow line.
Yeah.
If the eyebrow line goes up, that's terror. When the eyebrow line goes down, that's anger. She's like, okay, now the league's on strike. Now you're horny. So there's a fine distinction there, but yeah, she's like, oh yeah, now we got it. Yeah. So anyway, no, I was just, that was one of those cartoons everyone can relate to, certainly. Yeah. But yeah, nothing better to do. The league's on strike.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's almost like a manga thing. They have there all these symbols. If
Yeah.
one eye goes, the one
Yeah,
means something, or the emojis, I guess.
Yeah,
also.
No, it's
Good. Now, the next one is very elaborate. It's the Political Party's Bookstore. Was published the day after the Liberal Party released a document called Creating Opportunity. And it was promoted as a plan, and I'm quoting, for running an activist government in an area of limited resources. So Bruce has copies of the manifesto in the fiction section of the bookstore, whereas the Tory economic platform was in the horror section, the NDP is in the humor section, the Reform in the occult section, and the Bloc in the foreign section, etc. And I'm missing one or two.
Yeah, the National Party, Mel Hertig at the time, he was in the fantasy section.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did this great idea come about?
I don't know, it must have been in a bookstore. You just never know. I probably looked at the reviews of the liberal economic platform and just say, well, that's all fiction, and then that probably took me to a bookstore in my tiny brain, and so how could I describe the rest of them? Because anyway, we had a few more parties than we have now.
Yeah.
At the time, certainly with the Reform Party not being attached to the Tories, and the Bloc and the National Party, which is, I think, a distant memory now. But yeah, it was fun. It was fun coming up with all the different categories for the various parties.
Yeah. The darker part of the ceiling, is that also some special material, or is it hand drawn?
That is up there is it's all pen and ink. It's a little streaky. So the ink didn't cover quite as well. When you're rushing through and trying to make a deadline, then it's not always perfect. But the interesting thing is where it says liberal, the liberal book. Mm-hmm. That's another thing that cartoonists used to use. Some people might remember this letter set.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember? Yeah, I actually used to cut it out and put it down if I wanted a gray tone over something. I wasn't always using the duo shade. They just moved my office. I'm working from home full time now. They needed the space at the Herald. I've told them for years, I was only going in once a week, and I haven't gone in since the strike started. So I told them I don't need the office here. I can work full time from home. Mm-hmm. If you're okay with that. So they just moved the contents of my office back to my home a couple of weeks ago, and I threw out all this letter set that I had in it. There's no use for it anymore, But it's interesting over the run of a career, especially all the different things that you try in terms of media to make illustrations in different ways. You go through all kinds of crazy things. I use Scratchboard from time to time, which is like working in the negative. It's instead of using a pen, you actually use a knife, and Scratchboard sometimes comes black, and so what you're doing is you're drawing and scratching in white out of the black, and that can be an interesting effect if you're doing sort of a dark scene to begin with, and you just want to draw the highlights and so on. There are a million different, and if I'm guilty of anything now, it's not trying enough new materials often enough. But the problem is, in the run of a working day, you don't have a lot of time to experiment. You still have a deadline at 5 o'clock. So.
Cartoon from 1994, Prime Minister Chrétien telling a homeless person, do you realize the average MP makes half what the lowest paid player in the NHL makes? And the man suggests, perhaps you should try out for the team. Mm-hmm. That was a comment on a report recommending a 37% pay increase for MPs. And that was quickly rejected by the then Treasury Board President. I'm curious the way you chose this hockey comparison to illustrate what was going on. Was that something that was in the news, the lowest paid
No.
player, or?
Well, it was in the news because Chrétien actually used that as a defense in question period in the House of Commons. Yeah, he actually stood up and said that. And actually, there may be a little confusion because it actually responded to, he was responding to a question by Deborah Gray, who was the Reform Party MP, or yes, an MP at the time. And Deborah Gray was saying she wanted, and I assume speaking for her party, wanted to opt out of the lavish pension plan, which she was rhyming off was for Perrin Beatty. He had $5 million pension coming to him, and a lot of sort of career politicians had these huge lavish pensions, which the Reform Party was railing against. Grassroots hate this. Why do we have it so good and all that kind of thing. That all faded away pretty quickly. When Harper got to power, there's no problem with the pension anymore. But at the time, it was Deborah Gray standing up and asking that question, and Chrétien came back with this response. And at the time, that the lowest paid player in the NHL makes, that the average MP makes half what the lowest paid player. And everyone's going to kind of snort at that. I know I did. NHL players aren't doing too badly. So, right now I think it's $500,000 or something like, or more, so your basic minimum wage.
Like 5 times now.
Yeah. The average MP wasn't doing too bad regardless.
The next cartoon, the next national cartoon, shows people lining up to buy $6.49 tickets while no one's in line for the Liberal Job Creation Initiative.
Yeah.
So again, it's something from an Eastern Canada point of view, isn't that?
Yeah.
Isn't it?
We were kind of used to, government job creation programs not working out as well as lottery tickets. And lottery tickets are, a pretty popular thing on the East Coast. I think when the region is, for the most part, struggled or been behind other areas of Canada economically for so long, you kind of get used to falling back on your lottery tickets.
A couple of ladies. First, Audrey McLaughlin. After she resigned as leader of the NDP, she has a steering wheel around her neck, and she comments, "Maybe I should let someone else drive."
Yeah. Well, Audrey was trying to get traction for quite a while after Broadbent retired, and it just wasn't there for her. I think she had problems with the unions, and I'm not sure. This is one of those issues I'd have to transport back in time and try to recall exactly what the root of all her problems were. She was I believe the first female leader of a federal party, major federal party. So that was one accomplishment. But in that 93 election, it was 93, it was pretty, actually they lost official party status. So the party was more or less decimated. So you're trying to show the wreckage without actually having to draw all the wreckage, If you've got a steering wheel wrapped around your neck, then something bad's happened. And she was having her come to Jesus, as they say.
Alexa McDonough is the next one, and that's again Mariah from The Sound of Music, and she's singing "Climb Every Mountain." So maybe it's time to pause and ask you about cultural references. It seems to me you use song and films more than other cartoonists. Is that? Do you feel that's a trademark, or you think you're doing as much as your peers, or?
It really occurred to me until I saw this show, to tell you the truth. I'm starting to realize I do use a lot of songs, or at least I did. Oh, by the way, the introduction, I don't remember actually including the Bruce and Jay stuff, especially the stuff about the Best of Halifax thing. I don't remember I can't imagine I sent that to you. Oh, is that right? Okay.
We have like 200 archivists, so
Okay.
there's nowhere to hide.
As long as people don't think I was trying to plug the show, you know.
No, they don't.
But you know, the fact is, I am very involved in music. I love music, and what's more, I don't know, culturally memorable, I guess, than this movie, The Sound of Music, and it seemed to, it fits so well with Alexa McDonough because she's in her role as leader of the provincial NDP party. She was kind of the, as the NDP tend to be when in opposition, the conscience of the government kind of thing. And so it's in some ways, not being in government isn't a great thing, but in some ways being in opposition is a good thing for your, you can be holier than thou. You can, present ideas that might not be, fiscally workable, but they're morally, high ground. So she was the Maria von Trapp, of the legislature, and squeaky clean and very likable. And now she's going off to Ottawa. So had a little fun with that.
I'm going to fast forward to 19 because I want to leave time for questions from the audience. So the one I'm looking for is the one with the Ayatollah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
There. And so we're going international now. And he's just issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie. And a man is holding the receiver of the Allah hotline, and he tells Khomeini that Allah wants him to lighten up.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Oh, there's just, everything that was coming out of Iran at the time was just, death to America, death to Rushdie, death to this, death to that. It was pretty dreary, really. And they use, there's a lot of language, infidels and so on. And it's all very dark, Obviously, these, the fatwas and so on. So anytime you can juxtapose that with just some simple, casual, come on, lighten up. Yeah, that it's the contrast. It's that hopefully affects the humor.
When did you ever feel afraid or scared when all the before the Charlie Hebdo, there was also was it Sweden?
Denmark.
Denmark. Did you ever personally feel threatened, or that you could be, or?
No, there were a couple of things that have happened. You get some blowback every now and again. But I'm in Canada. Of course, Denmark is a very similar sort of, democratic nation, and bad things happened there. No, you sort of just try to be honest and say what needs to be said, try to be fair, and that kind of thing. There are crazy people out there. There are unreasonable people out there. I did have, like I say, some blowback. There was one year where I ended up with a human rights complaint against me, which was eventually just dismissed because it was unfounded. But I was talking to some interesting people at the time who heard from other people, were kind of scary individuals that they'd received death threats from and that kind of thing. So, it comes around every now and again, but by and large, compared to any other, region you might be drawing cartoons in, Canada, I think, is about as safe and secure as you could get. And there could be an explosion next door tomorrow, and because it can happen anywhere. Yeah. But I think here, I've heard of crazy things happening. I could be working in the U.S. They have a lot of guns down there, and someone with a beef has a lot more access to a gun if they want to come and knock on your door. There was a cartoonist whose office was ransacked, and he was someone stabbed him in the back with scissors or something like that. This is in the U.S. recently. You know, it happens. But for the most part, I feel pretty safe. Mind you, I had my wife got me a vanity plate years and years ago that said cartoon on a license plate for my car. And I drove it around with it on for about a year, and then I thought, you know, I make just enough enemies out there that it'd probably be a good idea just to take this off and keep it as a souvenir before my car gets keyed or something. So.
The next one is another song reference to pop culture.
Yeah, geez.
So Maggie Thatcher is being serenaded by Nelson Mandela, and he's singing Rod Stewart's Maggie May.
Yeah.
And that after, of course, Thatcher eased some of the UK's economic sanctions against the white South African government. So again, pop song, very enthusiastic Nelson Mandela with the guitar.
Yeah. I guess you're right about the music thing. It's on my mind a lot, apparently. I don't know if I've been doing as much of it lately, but yeah, I enjoy drawing that one. I enjoy drawing guitars and big amplifiers and things like that. But yeah, that was. We're gonna do one or two again. So I'm gonna skip over the next one and go to, that's Bill Clinton, of course. Yeah.
Bomb Your Way to Popularity, and that's I like this one. It's so Jean Chrétien and the Queen, and the context is Chrétien's in London for a NATO meeting. It's '94, and they were talking about the situation in Bosnia, etc. And so he gets an audience with the Queen, and she was dealing with, you know, the difficult relationship between Princess Diana and Prince Charles. And she goes, "I understand you're here to discuss peacekeeping." And he says, "Oh no, your family matters are none of my business."
Good French accent.
Well, I can do better. We'll work on it. So yeah. So again, you found a way to have two worlds actually, you know, talk to one another in the same picture.
Yeah, yeah. This was Diana and Charles. Diana was still alive at the time, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So there was yeah.
Was the beginning of the
crazy stuff. Yeah. So yeah, I don't have a great. Tell you the truth, I'm not sure how many readers do, but I don't have the great interest in the royal family's affairs. You know, I don't know. I'd rather draw about things that you know, affect us through, you know, draw about government issues, about political issues and that kind of thing. And I don't know. To a degree, it feels like an invasion of privacy, and to a degree, it's just boring to me. But yeah, with Chrétien over there. Yeah, he always knew how to say the right thing, so so I thought I'd tie those two issues together.
The other one is also about Nelson Mandela. Okay, and it's a very serious portrait, and you do some of those, obviously. He's got an arm raised and a shackle around his wrist with a broken chain, and you would think that's a comment on his going out of jail, but it's not. It's a comment on him winning the South African election. So to you, that was more total freedom than him being freed from jail?
Yeah, I mean, when the ANC won, that was, you know, that was really the culmination of his legacy, finally, you know, a black government in power in South Africa. So, yeah, it's a metaphorical freedom more than anything else.
And just one last question while looking at this. How do you make a decision? Because obviously not of all your cartoons are serious, etc. So how does that decision come about that you'll do a serious drawing instead of a joke, as it were, or something like that?
It depends on the seriousness of the issue, and this was a pretty dramatic moment. Also, if it's when I'm being a critic, it's easier to be funny, as you want to be satirical and sarcastic and cynical and all those things. But when something good has happened or something very sad has happened, if someone has passed away that meant a lot to people, that doesn't call for a yuck.
Yeah, of course.
So
Except you could choose to comment on something else.
yeah, but sometimes the issue is too big for that. And I don't like to, it's not, I'd rather make people laugh. That's the bottom line. But I've been in this situation a lot. The Nathan Cirillo cartoon was a classic example. There's no room for jokes in a situation like that, really. I mean, you can work it. It's you have to be very careful how you do it, but it's and even when you do a serious cartoon, in the case of the War Monument cartoon, it's an explosive situation. People's emotions are running very high, and if you leave anything open to interpretation, it could be taken several ways. That's very dangerous because I don't mind people disagreeing with me. I encourage it. You're supposed to provoke discourse and dialogue and make people think. But if people completely misinterpret a cartoon, you can waste a lot of time trying to explain what you meant to say, and that kind of deflates the cartoon and the message. So you want to be. It's sensitive. If the issue is sensitive, you have to be as clear as you possibly can.
Okay, so we have like 10 minutes for questions. Anybody feels the urge, just stand up, because I don't think we have microphones in the room, so just stand up and shout it out. Yes, sir?
Yes, for so many of your cartoons are political. I was wondering if you have the experience censorship.
A lot more when I started out, almost not at all now, but it still does happen. When I started out, there were so many levels of sort of management and oversight at the Herald, and they hadn't, Chambers had been in the position for over 40 years and had retired 10 years before I started. So they hadn't had an in-house political cartoonist for 10 years. So I go in and I'm fresh out of NASCAD, and they're kind of looking at me like, okay, this could be an adventure. This guy could get us in a lot of trouble. And everything was run by lawyers. I remember I would do the cartoon, the pencil sketch, and had to take photocopies of it. I think it was 7 or 8 photocopies, and they went upstairs to the executive floor, and they got passed around to everybody. And most of the time, when a cartoon got axed, it didn't happen till the end of the day. Someone would be humming and hawing over it, and okay, well, this is, this issues before the courts, or this is that, and whatever. And I would have finished the cartoon, and that's when my editor would come in. And my editor, Bob Howe, is the same editor I still have, and he would say, "The Grim Reaper's here," and it was always really upsetting because I don't draw the cartoons to have them pulled. You put a day's work into something, and you want it to see the light of day. So I've had a lot of battles early on with my editors for the first 10, 15 years. Jane Purvis would have been another one. We had some heated arguments. I love Jane. She had a world of respect for her, but when our opinions clashed, we were honest, and we fought it out, kind of thing. And most of the time I lost. But she was great. There was one I won on, and I was really surprised. It was an Alan Eagleson cartoon where he ended up in jail, and who was there with him? Oh yeah, James, the coach from out west. That was Graham James, exactly. So they find themselves in the same prison cell together, and James was saying, or was it the other way? It was Eagleson said, "What a coincidence! I'm here and here for screwing hockey players too." And I didn't think it was going to go. Yeah, see. And so I went out to the newsroom. I thought, this idea is going to get killed. So I better clear it with Jane first. And she'd just come from some meeting in the executive offices, and she was just, she was really ticked. Something had not gone her way, and she was really upset. So timing was perfect. And I showed her the idea. I said, "Am I going to be allowed to do this?" And she looked at it, and she said, "Oh, what the hell? Nothing else can go wrong today." So she actually let me run it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I'm curious, when you were told at the end of the day that the cartoon wouldn't go, did you have to draw another one, or did you skip a day? Or?
I kind of dug my heels in it. The fact is that really at 4 or 5 o'clock, they want the cartoon. Really, it has to be shot and in the process by then. So, I'm not going to create a cartoon in 15 minutes. I can't. I don't know a cartoonist that can, unless you're Ben Wicks or something. And, so yeah, it was kind of like, that was kind of my way of, okay, fine. If you're going to censor me, then you don't get a cartoon today. And I never put it to them in those words. I liked working for the Herald. But there were a lot of conflicts in those first 10 years, and I was partially finding out where the lines were and that kind of thing. These days, it's a different situation because I work from home, and if an idea isn't going to fly, if it's legally unpublishable or whatever it happens to be, or for matters of taste, which still come up from time to time. Then I find out when I always call an editor and say, "This is my idea," or I run a few by them, and they'll tell me at that point, before I've put ink on paper, whether it's going to fly or not. So, it's more efficient. I don't lose any cartoons.
No.
Yeah.
Did you keep the ones that were rejected?
I have a bunch. Yeah. I mean, there was one that I had a fight with Jane about. That was when Gerald Regan was in court over the issue of sexual harassment and so on. It was actually in the news story in the paper that he had to be fingerprinted for this charge and so on, and. So I had a cartoon that just said "Former Premiers of Nova Scotia," and I had Angus L. MacDonald, a number of them. I think Don Cameron was in there, and right in the middle, and they were little caricatures, so they were little portraits, and there were like 5 of them. And right in the middle was Gerald Regan, and it was a thumbprint instead of a caricature. And they pulled it, and I said, "On what grounds? It says right in the paper today that he was fingerprinted, for this." And I was even on the phone with the lawyer who said it's about the implication of his guilt before the trial and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know. That just didn't compute with me. I'm being fairly factual in what I'm presenting here, but they were sort of taking it a step beyond in the way I guess lawyers have to be prepared to think. So yeah.
So you've kept it.
I still have that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you ever think of a national institution that would host it, you know where to find us. Is there one quick question? One last.
Are there other publications that you work for?
I get published in a lot of different areas, but as far as I've one full-time position, and that's at the Herald. My work appears in all kinds of books and collections and that kind of stuff. It's also syndicated all over the world, so it can turn up anywhere. The syndicate is based in Alberta, and it's actually run by a cartoonist associate of mine who started about the same time I did. And he created this syndicate called Artisans, and there are hundreds of cartoonists there now. But I was the first on his roster, and he and I kind of worked out the contract together, and basically it went from the old syndicate days of they used to fax things out, or they went out over the wire, and of course now it's all internet based, and he was kind of on the cutting edge of that process. So yeah, the cartoons can be published almost anywhere, but I have one main employer, and that's the Herald.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Bruce, for being so generous with your time.
My pleasure.
And have a nice day, everyone.
Thanks for coming. Thank you.